Okay, welcome everybody to the FileMaker Pro user group, Dallas, Texas. It is July 7th. I'm Taylor Sharp. Greg Price and myself are your chapter co-coordinators, and we're glad to be here today. I'm joining everybody from Montana, so I'm enjoying some cool weather up here. I wish I could send it down to you guys, but anyway. For announcements, I've been out of the hat for a week or two, so I don't know if there are any new FileMaker announcements other than, of course, we got the FileMaker Engage coming in February. I know there's October will be the Pause on Air. Today we have Paul Mitchell's here. He's with Harmonic Data, which is one of the platinum FileMaker Claris developers. And he has been troopsing around the world sharing what he's going to share with us today. So we're quite jealous. So we know that if he's given to the internationally, he's practiced up and is going to give us a real professional one here. We're looking forward to hear from him. Just don't do it in German this time. So, so without further ado, Paul, it's good to have you. Let's hear what you have to teach us.
Thanks very much, Taylor. Yes, I gave this presentation in Berlin a month ago, 5 weeks ago today, at the .fmp.berlin conference, so it's the same slide deck. So, scope control. We're going to talk about how to understand the client workflow, gather requirements, determine the appropriate scope, and keep that scope under control. Keep things from getting out of hand. Hello, I'm Paul Mitchell. No, the shampoo was not named after me. Everybody asks that. Potbelly Sandwich Works is named after me. I've been a FileMaker Pro professional since 1998. I spent 4 years working in FileMaker tech support. I've been an in-house developer for 2 different companies for a total of 9 years. I previously worked at Soliant Consulting and Productive Computing, but now I've been at Harmonic here for almost 7 years, which is the longest I've ever worked anywhere in my life. I'm an engineer on our low-code team, and I also help out with sales and marketing as the sales engineer. I am a Claris FileMaker certified developer. I'm a veteran of the Air Force, having served in West Berlin. I made a point of mentioning that in Berlin. Hey, it was my first time back in 40 years. Married since 1995. I'm a father of 6. There's some of my kids there. And you can find out more about me at hard.fm/Paul, including my direct phone number and my email address. How many people on this call are FileMaker developers or here in the room, FileMaker developers? Yeah, everybody in the room except Fred. Yeah, okay. How many of us are certified FileMaker developers in any way? Cool. All right. How many of us have a computer science degree? Anybody? Not me either. How many of us dreamed as children of growing up to be FileMaker Pro developers? Anybody? Nobody dreams of being a FileMaker Pro. We all just kind of come to FileMaker Pro not saying, oh, I want to work with computers, not I want to be a software developer. We do other things. In my case, I got a degree in economics. I got a job in a training company. And then I just I needed something, and so I got hired to do tech support, and they taught me FileMaker. A whole lot of other people have got into FileMaker through other means. They were working at some other company that used FileMaker, and they became the person who was good at it. Nobody comes directly into FileMaker. We all kind of come sideways into it, don't we? And so we don't learn a lot of the disciplines of software project management, development, and so forth. And a lot of us are self-taught, and a lot of us have come into this by the means of, by a wide variety of means. And so what I'm going to share with you today is my opinion. It is not based on my personal expertise. It's my opinion. It's my effort to learn from the experiences that I have either seen directly or witnessed. Let me just start by defining my terms. So these definitions, and I'm not going to read all 5 of them to you, are from dictionary.com, and they all define the word scope in different ways. But for our purposes, the scope of a software project includes everything that's required to enable the agreed functionality of the resulting app. And in my opinion, the most important word in that whole definition is the word agreed, because it depends on communication. Let me tell you a sad story. I came in as a developer on a software project. I came on after the workflow was studied and the scope was defined by other people. It was a major upgrade to a key module of the client's FileMaker Pro database, which they used to run their entire operation. It was the final client meeting before we were going to deploy the update, and one of the users in the meeting asked, "How do I do fill in the blank?" And I said, "Is that something you do regularly? Do you do that in the current system?" Yes, she could, and yes, she did. Well, everybody loves scrambled eggs, but nobody likes to have to scramble to get a project done right. So some very uncomfortable conversations followed with the client, with the design team, and among the development team. And as we scrambled to correct this scope deficiency, there was a great deal of scope creep. So let me come back to these two terms. Scope creep. Who's heard the term scope creep? Those of you in the room, raise your hands. Okay. I did a Google search. I got thousands and thousands of hits. It's a very common term of art. Of course, we all know. Scope creep is when the client or even the developer wants to add features or functions that are not in the agreed scope. It's not really part of the MVP, that minimum viable product. And that's a new term to me. I first heard it one of Heather's presentations 8 months ago, something like that. And I've become a big fan of that concept, and I want to explore that more. But it's not truly part of the software that you actually need to develop to get this project done. There are risks involved with scope creep. You get potential budget and schedule overruns and the bad feelings that come along with this. And there's a worse risk. Last-minute modifications can break working code. Something works. Oh, I have to change this other thing, and you think it's not related, and it is. But there's an opportunity. Maybe you can deliver with the minimal overruns and be a hero. I love that feeling. Scope deficiency. Who's heard the term scope deficiency? Anybody ever used it? I did a Google search and didn't find any. I may have coined a new term. By scope deficiency, I mean when it's discovered that the defined scope won't support mission-critical functionality. One of the other presenters in Berlin talked about a similar concept. He called it emerging requirements. It's when you're working along in the project and you discover, oh, here are more requirements that we didn't know about. So the user won't be able to use this app that's built according to this scope to do his job. Same risks as above, but now they're not optional. Now you also have the same opportunity. Maybe you can deliver with minimal overruns and be a hero, but now it's a Curious George kind of situation where you're solving a problem that you participated in creating. So I spent a lot of time on this question. How could we have avoided this moment? This quote is from my very favorite movie, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. I highly recommend it. There must have been a moment at the beginning when we could have said no. To me, that important phrase is at the beginning. Because don't we plant the seeds of our success or our failure right at the outset of a new enterprise? And so I started casting around, and I found that there's an entire discipline out there that we FileMaker developers, having come to it from other industries, having come to our software building from other employment, from other career fields, generally seem to miss. And it's called project management. And so I've been looking into this, and here are some concepts that I want to talk about as we go forward as ways to avoid the kind of sad situation that I was talking about. First is communication. The goal of our communication is to reach agreement with the client on what's needed from the software to support the workflow we're going to support. That means not only do we have to study the workflow and figure out, okay, here's what you need. We have to communicate that with the client before we start developing and make sure that we're on the same page about what we're going to deliver. We have to agree on expectations around the budget, the development schedule, and how we're going to communicate through the project. We have to be clear with the client about their responsibility for defining the scope, the testing, the communication. We have to make sure we have their buy-in because the client has to be part of the project. They have to be an active part of the development team. So communication is not a step that we can complete. It's the foundation of the whole project. Then we have to define what we're actually going to build. We got to observe their existing workflow in depth, but we also need to discuss with them what they want the workflow to be like. It may be a case where you're building something not to replace something else or upgrade something else, but for an entirely new enterprise. They've never had any software before. They've never done this before. They're starting something new. They know they need software for it. So you got to discuss them. What do you want the workflow to go like? How do you want this to work? But you also have to explore the side paths. What about the exceptions? Frequently, I've found myself talking to a client, okay, here's our process. They'll tell you the process. Okay, that's no problem. And then they'll tell you 85% of the time. We've heard this, haven't we? Oh yeah, that's how it works most of the time. But sometimes it's this completely other thing. And that completely other thing that they use 10 or 15% of the time might be 50% of your development efforts. So we got to explore those side paths, the exceptions to the main path. And what about user errors? What do we want the software to do if the user actually enters wrong data?
What?
Yeah, users aren't perfect either. That's our whole point of this presentation is none of us are perfect. So we all have to take responsibility for that. So we got to talk about what do we want the software to do when a user puts in a wrong date? Not just an invalid date, but a simply wrong date. You know, maybe a little wrong. What provisions are we going to permit them to correct that data? What do we want the software to do? What do we have to enable the user to be able to do? We got to interview the end users and consumers of the end products, not just people who are going to be using our application, but the people who are going to be getting the reports out. Are we exporting data for accountants? Are we exporting data for managers? Are we issuing some kind of reports? We need to make sure that we know what the consumers of the output of the database are expecting. This is a stage where we define the scope. What does the software have to do? Then we're going to design it. This is the part we're all good at. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because we all know this stuff. Decide on what the best ways are to fulfill the scope. Data definitions, UI UX design, accessibility, automation, reports. What technologies are we going to use? Are we going to use FileMaker Pro, FileMaker WebDirect, FileMaker Go? Are we going to do custom web publishing? You know, what are we going to do? How is it going to be hosted? Is it going to be hosted on Windows, on Linux? God help us on Mac. What are we using? Is it going to be AWS Cloud, FileMaker Cloud, on-prem? What kind of security do we need? Accounts and privileges. This is where we define the software. This is where we design the software. How does it do the things that it has to do? This is the thing we're all good at. And I don't need to tell you how to do this because you guys are all good at this. We need to document the scope because this is how we're going to communicate with the client. Start with user stories and use cases, but that by itself isn't documentation. That's the thing we use to build the rest of the documentation. From our user stories, we can then design wireframe interface designs, build that list of supported tasks and functions, possibly even start a future phase or a future feature function list. The FFF list, I like that. The future list. What is it going to do in the future? Not now, not this version, but hey, this will be good to do in the future in the second phase, in the third phase. Maybe build an entity relationship diagram. I tend to start with that. That's how I get my head around a project. Write a test plan. If you can design to the test, if you got a thing that says it has to do this, when I do this, I want to be able to do this. It has to result in that. If you can design a detailed test plan in advance that your developers can develop too, they know when they've succeeded. You might want to build in a Gantt chart. You will certainly want to have some kind of development schedule, and you're going to want to have a budget. And these all have to be things that the customer you're going to talk to about. It cannot be just simply make it do everything that database does, because that's not documentation. So then we go back to the customer the client with our documentation. This is the scope, and so they need to be aware and familiar and conversant with all the documentation. We need to make sure that he understands and agrees with it all. Now, odds are your client is not an expert on software development projects. Maybe they haven't been through any. Maybe they haven't been through as many as you have. The point is, we have to lead our clients to this point. We have to help them understand that this is a project that they are part of. They're not just going to watch us do it. They're not going to drop off the car and then come pick it up later. We got to communicate with them throughout the project. They have to be on the same page with us as what we're delivering. And then we have to make sure that we've got someone working as the project manager who's responsible to update the documentation, especially the budget and the schedule, as the scope of the project changes. Because you know what? The scope of the project changes. And that has to be something that you're communicating with your client on, documenting, and they have to share the responsibility for when the scope changes. The question, how did we miss this, is not just a question for the developers, it's a question for the clients too. When we've got something that, oh, you didn't tell me about this, it's not a question of trading blame back and forth. It's, this is a requirement or it's not a requirement. You're bringing up something new. We need to be communicating in a way where they're expecting to hear back, all right, here's what, if that's a need, here's what it's going to take to fulfill that need. We want to avoid that blame culture, and we want to avoid having that kind of unpleasant conversation about, oh, we missed this. But if we miss this, it's we all miss this. Not just the developers, not just the design team, but also the client and the users who signed off on a project that said, yes, this is what we need you to do for us. And then that's not what they need us to do. Next is the execution phase. Again, this is the part we're good at. We've got to make constant use of the documentation, though. Once we've got documentation, we need to be frequently comparing our output to the requirements. So when you get clever ideas for features to add, and you will because you're clever, put them on the list for the next phase. Don't just add them to the current build. And then you got to find the right pace to develop at. If you're going too fast, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to get burnout. You're going to lose sleep. If you're going too slow, you'll forget what you did last week. And your client's going to have a limit too as to how big your invoices can be. So that'll also be a constraint on how fast you can develop. Got to test it. Got to test it. And we start testing before we're finished developing. We're going to use that test plan we wrote at the beginning of the project. We're going to test with user privileges, not just developer privileges. We're going to have users test as well as developers. But don't let users add new features to the MVP in the testing phase. They're going to want to. Do let users suggest new features for the future phase. And when scope deficiency arises, and this is when it will, we've got to communicate with the client to revise the budget and schedule. Say, oh, it's been discovered. We have discovered together something that we together didn't previously realize. So after all corrections are done, we've got to test everything again. I mean, everything again, because new changes can break working code. So you make a change, you think, oh, I'll just test that change. No, you've got to test everything because it may have broken something else that you don't realize it's connected with. And this is why we have to avoid last-minute fixes. You don't want to just, oh, I can fix that as you're deploying software. We really, really, really want to avoid that. That leads to tears. So we keep communicating with the client. Got to confer often. Show off the work in progress. Keep them up to date about obstacles, delays, solutions. We've got to be transparent about that. If you can keep up their enthusiasm for the project, that means more prompt payment of your invoice. Finally, we deliver the product. But of course, we never just drop off the package and walk away. We're not Amazon. Got to schedule time for post-delivery bug fixing. That's got to be part of the schedule. That's got to be something that we're talking about from the very first. This is the period during the project where we will fix the bugs. Clients don't like to talk about bug fixing, but the fact is bug fixing is part of all software development. Microsoft releases software with bugs, then they release updates. Apple releases software that has bugs, and then they update it. Claris releases software with bugs, and then they update it. We all have bugs in our software, and it always needs to be fixed. Don't feel bad about it. I know I personally take bugs in my software because I take it personally. What do you mean my stuff isn't perfect? I mean, nobody's perfect. I'm not perfect, but my software is supposed to be perfect. Mm-hmm. That's not realistic. It's not realistic for me to think it of my own software. It's certainly not realistic for my clients to think about that for my software. So we got to schedule time for that. Don't let bugs get you down. It's just part of software development. Your client can't afford a developer who never lets bugs in. And if he could, he would have hired him in the first place. If he could find him. Because, of course, we know there isn't anybody that does that. You never promised that there would be no bugs. We need to be promising that there will be. We need to be talking from the beginning. When the bugs come up, here's how we're going to address them. But this is not the time to let scope creep get in. There will be ideas for new features while you're fixing bugs. Add them to the list. Rinse and repeat. Schedule a meeting to review the finished project with the client. Get their feedback if you haven't already, especially when you want to know what you can do better next time. Because if you're not learning from the current project, you're missing something important. And of course, bring along your next phase feature list to that meeting and start planning the next phase of the project. Don't skip on the steps. Make sure you document the next phase as well as you did the first one. So in the words of Russell Brand, that's just what I think. What do you think? So now is the conversation part of the meeting. So what do you think? Like I say, I'm not an expert on this. This is just what I've been thinking about. Like so many of these other presentations we do, this is not my expertise. It's my opinion, and it's the thing that I'm studying right now of how can we do this stuff better. Go ahead and toss out whatever questions, comments you've got. Heather, you had your hand up a minute ago.
I did. At one point, you were talking about scope change. And I was just going to comment that my kitchen contractor called those change orders.
Yeah.
And so I think my point in bringing that up is that other contractors in other fields that build things, as we do, they know about these things.
Yeah.
They have a way of handling them. And if a client comes up with an idea or a client forgot about something, if it wasn't in the initial plan, then it's a change order.
Right.
And I pay more for it. You know, so, and we as software developers, maybe other software developers are used to this, but FileMaker developers, in my experience, we feel bad about that.
I have the exact same
And
experience.
we
You're right.
feel- We tend to feel guilty. Oh, how did we miss that? How did we not think of that? Whatever it is that we're telling ourselves, and then we end up giving away money,
Yes.
right? And we have to learn, like my kitchen contractor, that it doesn't matter if he's the one who missed it or I'm the one who missed it. It got missed and it wasn't part of the original plan.
Exactly.
And therefore, it costs more.
And that's something that I really believe that we have to start communicating about from the very beginning of the project. And that's pretty much my whole point.
You know, long ago, before we had services like Uber, I drove a cab when I was 20 years old. And if somebody got in the cab, they couldn't ask me to give them a quote on how much money it's going to cost to get them from JFK Airport to someplace in New Jersey. There was a meter, and the meter ran, and they paid when they got where they were going. You couldn't predict whether there was going to be traffic along the way or not. Now, it's hard to apply the same thing today when we have services that can calculate all of that stuff automatically. But at some point, I find it necessary to remind a client, when it comes to scope, that if I was on their payroll as an in-house developer, my hourly rate might be different than it is as an outside contractor, but they wouldn't be questioning things about scope. I'd be on the payroll and I'd be told to do what's necessary to get it done, and it would take as long as it takes to get it done. It's not an absolutely parallel situation, but it speaks to what you were talking about communication. And one of the issues that we deal with today is that people are really bad at communication. If you give them explicit instructions where you detail something and it goes beyond 3 bullet points, they don't want to read it. And if you engage somebody in a Zoom call like we're doing today, you don't really have the certainty that they're paying attention. They could be clipping their nails or checking their email or doing something other than what you expect them to listen to. So I don't have a solution to it, but it's a problem that is really difficult to manage in today's world.
Well, I agree with all that, certainly, but I think increasingly our clients are expecting us to tell them what it's going to take in advance, even though in building custom software, we are by definition doing something that nobody's ever done this exact thing before. Nobody's ever made one of these before. It's not like
But there's 2 FileMaker characteristics that make that even more complicated. One is a unique attribute of FileMaker that doesn't exist in most other software products, which is that we can develop on the fly. Just to make up a real simple example, if you've done something for a client within the scope that sends an email and you get a phone call and they say, oh, could I add a CC recipient to those emails? You know that it'll take you 2 seconds to add that thing, and it would be more time consuming to write a memo that defines the scope of this particular enhancement than to just do it as a courtesy. But if they start asking questions that would involve a plugin or would involve hosting that they don't understand, then you're in a different dimension. And FileMaker tempts people into building on because it is so flexible and it has the tendency to inspire people to come up with new ideas for things that perhaps they didn't ever think about before, or as you said, they just didn't come up during the course of the discussion about the initial scope.
Which is something that I love about FileMaker. It does inspire that, oh, if you can do that, can you also do this kind of inspiration? And I love that.
Or as a client, can I jump in and do this?
Right.
Which they also do.
And following on with your example, Dennis, so they want to add a CC to the email, no problem. I think any one of us here would probably just do that. You're right. It's easier and quicker and cheaper to just do that and spend that 2 to 5 seconds to do that. But once they see that you've done that, they're probably going to also say, for example, well, you know that report that we just ran, I want to have that report as a PDF attachment to the email. Right? Well, that's not as simple. Yeah, if you think about it in your head as developer, you're thinking, oh, well, all I have to do is this, this, and that. Yeah, I can do that. But what we tend to not think about are the issues that we're going to encounter when they decide that the version of the report that's going to be included in the email might be slightly different. Like it's going to omit some columns that were not supposed to be not supposed to be included or distributed, and that there may be issues with their operating system or something with the export of this document and the creation of that. We think of the script steps, right? This is going to be easy. All I have to do is this step, this step, this step, and that step, and boom, I can add that feature. But we tend to forget about everything that surrounds building that feature for the client, because that is in fact a new feature that wasn't part of the scope, and it's going to involve communication and back and forth as we build it. And I think that's an area where we underestimate ourselves and the effort that's going to be involved, because it's not just us. I'm historically horrible at estimating. I understand that. I own it. I give my estimates.
Can I interrupt you for just a second on that?
Yeah.
One of the things I said in Berlin when about this point in the conversation was, if you think you're good at estimating in your own opinion, raise your hand. Anybody? I don't see anybody on the screen showing me their palm. Okay.
Yeah, so, well, thank you for making me feel better. but yeah.
Nobody in Berlin raised their hand either.
I give an estimate, and Steve and Matt automatically double or triple it, right?
Yep.
Because they know. Because what I don't take into account is the fact that I don't work in a vacuum. I have to deal with clients and their feedback and what they left out, and I have to deal with interruptions and, being human. And so we have to get away from the just thinking about the script steps that are going to be required in order to implement this functionality that they want. And so your example, I think, was really good, because add a CC, that literally is just a single step, right? And that's easy enough for us to do. But we are so inclined, once we've done that, to underestimate the effort that's going to be involved for something that sounds like just a little bit more and is related to, in fact, the same feature, which is the email. And we have to be really cautious about that.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd modify on what we were just talking about is that when we give a quote or an estimate, there's definitely a list of features that's in there. And anything they ask for, like the CC, right? If we could teach ourselves to make just a change in the conversation, we could just say, that should be pretty simple. Do you want me to do that? Because it's not on the list of things that we said we're going to do. And if they say, yeah, go ahead, it may be 5 seconds. Around here, we always build a minimum 15 minutes. So it may take 5 or 10 seconds and it's done. Maybe there's no complications and no other impacts, but now it's billable because it wasn't, the customer clearly sees, it wasn't in the original scope of work. I did want it, and I had a verbal estimate that it was going to be simple. And now it can show up on an invoice without any kind of, they can't say, hey, you told me this was a $500 job, and now it's $520. Was that bait and switch? No, you remember we had this conversation, and you followed up with an email. But regardless of whether there are other complications or not, it's out of the scope, and the customer needs to know about it so that everybody gets treated fairly.
Well, Bob, this is Taylor. One of the things, a couple of things have there is, first of all, I noticed you have a minimum time. You guys do a quarter hour. I know a lot of places the minimum time is an hour. So,
Yeah.
but that's an interesting thing also to have an agreement with a customer. If you have a small request, there is a minimum, just because it takes me 5 minutes to do. The reality is it takes more than that because there's the accounting and the everything that else goes with it. So, certainly, having an agreement of what a minimum hourly rate is if you are doing things by hourly versus project stuff is one thing. But the other thing, too, who is telling you to do this? And one of the things I like to be very clear in with my clients is, who is authorized? Who's my project manager? Who can tell me what to do? Because, everybody in the company can come up with good ideas and tell me, oh, I need this. But one of the questions that I always try to do is I try to make a point person as the project person that says, okay, great idea, run it through your project manager here. And when it shows up on my list, I can take care of that. But it needs to go whoever that project manager is, because among other things, you find out project managers also will say, well, we need that, but that's a low priority. And you can force it back to their project manager to decide when and how you're going to do that. And so that's one thing I try to do. And I also try to make each of my clients pick a single project manager. I don't want everybody to be my project manager.
Yeah, those are good.
There was a meeting we had a few months ago. You might remember who it was, but I brought up the subject of a glossary of FileMaker terminology that I give to the client. And there was a lady who attended that meeting, and I don't remember who she was, but she asked me to send it to her, and I did. And the point about it is that new clients especially don't understand certain terms that we speak in. It may be something like, what is hosting, or what is a plugin, or what is WebDirect? And I probably have 20 or 30 things in there and they do have an impact on cost.
Well, also, Taylor, if you're doing things by the project, you're trying to manage to that quote, if you will. Anything like adding a CC or a BCC or whatever to an email, that's not in the scope, and you're just absorbing it if you leave it as part of the project build. So, and maybe in that case it's not important, but if it turns out to be a new version of a report, et cetera, then that should be billed. It's not fair to us. It's for them to get that value without paying for it. So,
another thing too that I just thought of, Bob, as you were describing that, is that if we are also providing end user documentation, it may take us 3 seconds to add the CC, but how long will it take us to include the documentation of what they need to do for defining who the CC goes to, or that they want to have a CC in the first place or not? And that is going to be more than 15 minutes.
that goes to your comment about, as developers, we see everything as script steps and layout objects. That's just as valid and important a part of the delivery. And one other thing is we've done this at Harmonic recently, when you keep getting requests from the customer and you say, yeah, okay, we can do that, and we never say that's not part of the original scope, then we end up pushing the delivery date for the build out. And the cost of the software is not just your direct labor as a developer. It's the lost time when they don't get to use the delivered product. And that magnifies the cost of the project immensely. And we don't think in those terms because we're developers. Our only job is to build it. But for the guy that actually asked for the work, he was counting on getting these features by a certain date. And he may have a fabulous value to that. Like it could make his work half as costly. And now he's going to be losing that day after day after day while we keep fiddling with that email address. So those are other parts of the project equation, project management equation, that we don't think about as developers.
Clients also have a tendency to forget that they are, at minimum, equally responsible for delays. And so our reputation can be impacted by the slower delivery when, you know, the client is the one who's asked for additional things. They say yes in little bits and pieces along the way, but they still tend to expect delivery at the same originally quoted time.
And that's why I think it's important to have a project manager.
Mm-hmm.
I like what Taylor said about you want to have a contact on the client side who is the one person that can tell you, yes, add this to the project. But as the development team, we need to have someone functioning in that project manager role, capturing all those little things that come in and organizing them. Because, you know, if you've got one person calling you and asking for a CC on an email, somebody else asking for additional columns on a report, a third person, and maybe they're reaching out to different members of our development team to ask. Somebody needs to be getting all that in hand and maybe assigning it all to one developer. But especially if it's an ongoing large project and we've got just even one contact on the client side going, oh, we need to add these things to the project. We need to be replying to that not with, oh, sure, we can get that done, but yes, we can get that done, and here's what it will take in terms of additional time, additional budget, additional schedule.
Right. And I think that avoiding that circumstance where your reputation is impacted negatively because you delivered something later than the customer thought it was supposed to be, regardless of whose fault it was, and to not have to be pointing fingers or even feel like you should have to explain. It's communication all along way.
That's it. That's the only way to stay out of that, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even people that are just doing indie work or are in-house. My previous role was the IT director. I did all the FileMaker development at the company I worked in, and I learned what I had to learn pretty quickly was that I was getting lots of requests because I was the only developer in-house, and everybody's got a request. They all want something that's either not in the system or they want it to work the way they want it to work, and sometimes they're just conflicting, and sometimes there's just too many requests. And I overextended at the beginning of that role and quickly learned that when someone brings you a request that's going to interrupt the one you're working on, not to make that decision yourself, but to go to let that person know, here are the other things I'm currently working on. If you go talk to these other people that are going to be affected by this interruption and they give me their blessing, then that's what I'll do. That's the thing I'll work on. But instead of taking on those decisions myself and trying to assign different levels of importance to different people's work, because everybody's important, everybody's an emergency, of course, and so that was just resulting in a lot of stress that I was just needlessly taking on. So I always found it helpful to just say, hey, here's what's going on, go talk to the people affected, and if they don't mind their work being interrupted, then I'll make yours the priority then.
This is something that came up for me just yesterday. It was a client in Texas who I haven't heard from in a bunch of years, who called and said, can you write me a script to do something that I do manually? And I made this outline before I got on the phone. And as it turned out, and the guy has full access. He thinks he's a FileMaker. Well, I can't call him a developer, but he's in control of his own system. And as it turned out, I wrote the script for him using a Web Connect, a Zoom session. And we were probably on the phone for an hour and a half. Did he learn while he was watching? I don't know. His description of what he did manually was something that he couldn't understand how the same steps would be done in a script. These are the steps that I needed to take the guy through in order to explain how you would convert a manual procedure into a scripted operation in FileMaker. And just to illustrate, one essential piece of the communication is that he told me that
he performs a find, he gets like 4 dozen records, and he goes through them manually, but he could not grasp the fact that unless you tell the script how to go through them manually to omit certain things, it will not do it, and it will be sending emails to people you didn't expect to. So teaching him about features that are in his software, like saved finds, or the difference between plain text and HTML email, just took over an hour. And he'll pay for that hour, but I'm sure he didn't really learn it. If he's lucky, he'll be able to run the script. Kind of a guy who's been a novice user of FileMaker for probably 25 years.
Yeah, I remember doing tech support. We had to do a lot of that sort of thing. I remember teaching a woman to do just drag and drop on a desktop.
Reminds me of when I taught my husband how to create a button. Because he's definitely in that category of, longtime user, but that's about it.
Well, anybody else have anything? Gerard, Florence, Greg?
Well, just adding on what we've added on lately, I have a client that I've done some work for, and the quote is, "I need to have a button. I need to have a button." So the question is, and then it's always, well, that button on that other, going back to what the presenter did here, I have this button on this other page. I'd like to have it on this page. And, it all is about the perspective then, do we have the right perspective as far as the data is concerned and stuff like that? So people see what we do and they see it as being easy, like we've been talking about earlier, but it's, can you add a button? Can you add a button? So that's another common one that I hear often.
One of my favorite things is that clients never understand, users never understand how hard is their request. And sometimes they'll ask you for something that they think is the easiest thing in the world, and when you tell them it's going to be 3 weeks to get that done, they just don't understand. And sometimes they can call you up and say, "Oh, I need something. I'm really sorry to bother you. I know this is going to be a huge request." And they ask for it, and you can complete it while they're still on the phone, and they think you're a superhero. And that's always just a fun disconnect.
That has been my experience as well. I've had clients who are afraid to ask for things because they assume that they're going to be very complicated, and 9 times out of 10, if they were afraid to ask because they thought it was going to be too expensive, I can do it before the conversation's done.
Yep.
And they always underestimate what it's going to take to do things that they think are simple. Like, could I just have a back button?
Back to where?
A back
Heather,
button
the
on a
important
database.
thing about that is if the communication in the beginning, as Paul was saying, is solid, and they know that they're going to get charged for, it might be that minimum charge of 15 minutes, then you can very comfortably go ahead and do it. But you have to have that understanding in the beginning,
right,
that not everything is free.
One thing you got to also keep in mind is so often us FileMaker developers have a certain luxury that almost no other development framework does, is that we can work on a live system and make little changes to it. And in most development platforms, when you say you want to make a change, well, that makes it in development, and at some point it'll be moved into production. But anything you're asking for, nothing's done on the live system. And there's some people who develop it that way, and if you really want a rock solid system, that is how you do development, even though a lot of us FileMaker people don't do that. But you just have to also keep in mind, if you have a system where you're working on the development and it's not the production system, when someone says something like that, it's like, well, I can make it quick on the development system, but it's not going to be live on production, until the next tested version rolls out.
Exactly. Florence, did you have something to add?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to laugh. If I asked one of you to help me, you'd probably say that I think I'm a developer, but I'm really screwed things up. I've been running a program since FileMaker since the early 90s. So I've been trying to keep up with things, and that's one reason I joined the group. But I'm laughing because I can hear what you would say about me when I ask you to help me do something. But I found one of the most interesting things one of you said was that it's not just a change that makes, it's often you have to go into your how to do things for the client. I work at a university. I mainly do make a database for myself, but occasionally have to teach people how to use it. And that's what takes the time. It takes a lot more time to write up how to use it than it actually does usually to make something.
Yes.
Because there's rarely a request to make something that we haven't done before at this point.
Florence?
Florence, you bring up another point, which is that the client is using the system every day.
Yeah.
You may not have been under the hood in their system for a year and a half.
Oh, yeah.
And to refresh your memory on what it is that they're even talking about before you even do it is a time-consuming thing as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have a system that I've been building out over the years, and so you know, if I were to do it from scratch, it would be very different.
That's true for all of us.
Yes.
And just knowing where things are, sometimes it takes me a half an hour to even get into the system to figure out where I am in the world.
That's true for all of us.
And how I've named it. I mean, my naming conventions have changed over time as, people have found better ways to do it. My relationships on this database, I make it look as nice as I can, but some of them are just some of the relationships are outrageous because I did it at a point where you couldn't use parameters in links and filters. So you know what a mess it can be, and it looks neat, but it's still a nightmare.
Florence, I would like to share with you, first of all, I would never laugh at someone who asks questions and they want to learn. So don't feel like we would be laughing at you, because we would not. Second, you mentioned how long it takes to do the documentation. And I wanted to share my first experience with documentation was with one of my first clients back in like 99, 2000, way back. And when I was first out on my own as a consultant. And I wrote documentation because I felt like I assumed that should be part of what was provided, because as I thought about it, what good is the software that I deliver to them as the end product if they don't know how to use it? So I thought it was my responsibility to write the documentation to teach them how to use it, and it cost me more time. It took more time to do the documentation than it took to build the project, right?
Yes, up front.
Up front. And I had quoted a fixed price, right? So I learned my lesson that documentation is something that you have to include in your quote. You have to communicate that to your customers, that if you're going to provide documentation, that costs more, right? Again, going back to the developer guilt, like it was really guilt where I felt if I built something and it wasn't so obvious that they could just use it and know everything that it did and how it did it and how to use it, that was somehow my fault. And I have learned that is not true. And that documentation is real essential. In fact, one of the first year I spoke at DEF CON, one of my sessions was on documentation for that reason.
I always found it helpful to ask, especially like a new client, what other apps, what are you currently using? What is my software going to maybe replace for you? Or if they're not actively using something on a daily basis, what other apps do you like using? Maybe in a completely different space. What do you like about them? Do you like the fact that the interface is very, very minimal? Do you like the fact that it's verbose and you can do everything on one screen? Do you like that it seems to be guessing what your next step is going to be? And I always found that helpful as a guide, because then I could build maybe something that would be different than what I was envisioning while they're talking to me. I could just, take different sort of idioms from another app, even if it's not a database app.
That's a good example. We built a system many years ago for Apple, and we modeled the UI after iTunes. And
I was just thinking about that.
It worked.
Just what? I'm sorry.
We modeled the interface after iTunes, and while the data was not music but customers and sales data and things like that. The way that they got to it, the way they drilled into it was precisely the same way that it would work in iTunes if you put that kind of data into an iTunes interface. But having designed it following their own model, so that it should have been, as I said earlier, obvious how it works, right? And easy to use. I still had to provide documentation. Very detailed
Heather,
documentation.
I don't know if you remember that, Heather, but you did a presentation around the same time. It may have even been at the same meeting where you showed the thing that you did for Apple.
Mm-hmm.
And you changed my world at the time when you did a lesson on how to make a script. You were showing how when writing scripts you can have conditional steps rather than a duplicate of the script.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember that?
I do.
Yeah. I think hardly a week goes by when I don't bump into something that reminds me of your presentation. And that was maybe, 15 years ago?
Yeah, at least. Thank you.
Florence, were you about to say something?
No, I'm just listening. As I said, I'm sort of a lone wolf out here. But the university, we're interested in creating an awards database. And after our last meeting last time, I put in a chat GPT script and am now able to look at the names of people and that with some identifier like the university or award they won and get a very brief description of who the person is.
Wow.
And I've been able to save that. So that has been very helpful, just coming to the meeting and sort of finding out what you guys are thinking about.
Very cool. When Steve is on vacation this week, but when he comes back and watches this video, I hope he'll catch that.
Okay, well, everybody, it's fun having you here, and I guess it's time to go back, have a little more summer coolness up here north before I head back to Dallas there. I hope you guys are staying cool indoors there, and we will be back next month. I'm not even sure what our presentation is, but we will let you know. Everybody take care, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.